Kal v'chomer, but I'm going to wait till we do a few other Middos because the thing I want to share with you is connected to the relationship between the Kal v'chomer and the other Midah. So the second Midah of Rabbi Yishmael is that called a Gezerah Shava. And the Gezerah Shava I'm sure you've had a number of times. That is simply the idea that if the Torah uses the same word in two different places, the Torah is giving you a signal that you are to connect the two places. There are many examples of a Gezerah Shava. One example is the laws of Shlichus. So let me explain that. We know that there's a principle, Shalucho Shel Adam Kamoso, that if I make somebody a Shaliach to marry someone, to divorce someone, to sell my chametz, to buy property for me, so my Shaliach has the same power as I have. However, there's one big exception to the law of Shalichus, and that is called Ein Shaliach Lidvar Aveira. If I make you a Shaliach to desecrate Shabbos, or I make you a Shaliach to do something that's forbidden, instead of saying, when you're Mechalel Shabbos, it's like I'm Mechalel Shabbos, we say no. The Shaliach is Chayav and not the Mishaleach, because Ein Shaliach Lidvar Aveira. The Gemara has limudim for that. Now, the Gemara then says that there are certain Aveiros which are an exception to the rule, and there is a Shaliach for Devar Aveira. And one of the exceptions is Me'ila. Me'ila is wrongfully taking something that's hektish. If something was sanctified to the Beis HaMikdash, and I take it to use it, so the Torah says, I'm chayav a korban, asham, because of what is called me'ila, the wrongful appropriation of hektish. So imagine this. Let's imagine some money was dedicated to the Beis HaMikdash, and I instruct you to take that money and spend it in the store for me. I made you a shaliach to misappropriate sanctified money. So the Mishnah in Me'ila says that when you misappropriate sanctified money, since you acted as my shaliach, I am the one that is chayav, the korban, and not you. In other words, yesh shaliach lidvar aveira. So the Gemara asks, why should that be so? Don't we have a general rule of ein shaliach lidvar aveira? Why by Me'ila is it different? This is kind of a long example. So the answer the Gemara gives is, we have a Gezerah Shava between Me'ila and the separation of Truma. The same word is used, Chet, and therefore, just as by Truma, we know I could make you a Shaliach to separate Truma, because that's not an Aveira, so Me'ila as well, even though it's an Aveira, Yesh Shaliach Lidvar Aveira. So that's one example of a Gezerah Shava, Chet Mitruma, in which we learn out a halacha that there is shalichus by Me'ila, even though it is a Devar Aveira. So just as we did with Kal v'chomer, I'm going to go over a few rules about Gezerah Shavas and what is the basis of those rules. Did you want to say?
I think you're probably answering.
Okay, all right. Yeah.
Just the mic on your sleeve.
Oh.
I don't want you to...
Okay.
There you go.
Yep. Okay. So now let's go over a few rules. Rule number one is a statement that the Gemara makes in a lot of places, that you cannot make a Gezerah Shava, you meaning even a Sanhedrin. I mean, we can't do it anyway, but even a Sanhedrin cannot make a Gezerah Shava unless they were makabel it from their Rebbe. That's the lashon of the Gemara. Kibla me Rabbi. Because if you think about it, otherwise Gezerah Shavas, you can go crazy with the Gezerah Shavas. Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe Lamor. So it says Lamor, 5,000 times. Oh, Lamor, let's make a Gezerah Shava between Get and Shabbos, or whatever it would be. So obviously, the Torah does not mean every time you have the same word, you make the Gezerah Shava. You have to be makabel it from your Rebbe. Now, here's the question. Well, why is my Rebbe any better? I mean, could my Rebbe make a Gezerah Shava? Like, what do you mean, makabel from my Rebbe? So the normal way it's understood, although this is not necessarily from the Lashon, is that it has to be a halacha l'Moshe misinai. So it doesn't just mean, I got it from my Rebbe. My Rebbe has the same problem I have. If I can't make my own Gezerah Shabbos, my Rebbe can't make his own Gezerah Shabbos. But it means there was a tradition all the way, not tradition, a halacha, all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu, that certain pairs of words are to be used for purposes of comparison. Now, you may ask the following question. If every time there's a Gezerah Shava, it's really a halacha l'Moshe misinai, then how could there be arguments? You often have a machlokas. One person makes a Gezerah Shava, and the other and learns out a certain law, and another person doesn't darshan the Gezerah Shava. Right? That's a machlokas you'll have. One darshans Gezerah Shava, one does not darshan Gezerah Shava. But if Gezerah Shava was halacha l'Moshe misinai, how could there be a machlokas? Remember, the Rambam himself laid down the rule that whatever Hashem gave to Moshe was reliably passed down. So here, there's a certain subtlety you need to be aware of. When we say a Gezerah Shava is halacha l'Moshe misinai, we don't mean the law that is learned from the Gezerah Shava is halacha l'Moshe misinai. Rather, Hashem gave Moshe a list, so to speak, of which words are to be connected. And that list is a list. The Chachamim then use this koach to determine what laws should apply, what laws won't apply. So when you have a machlokas, you're only getting 50% of the issue, meaning that simply means you're using the Gezerah Shava for X, and I don't darshan the Gezerah Shava for X. I'm not denying there's a Gezerah Shava, and it'll be used maybe for something else. Of course, the Gemara doesn't always say what the something else is, but I'm not using it for X. Now, that's not a stira to the halacha l'Moshe misinai, because the halacha l'Moshe misinai never said that the word pairing is for X. It just said which are the word pairings that constitute the Gezerah Shava. Again, one of the things you see when you delve into drashas is really how incomplete the discussion we have is. Meaning the whole, we see in the Gemara the tip of the iceberg, but there's a whole bunch of discussion that for whatever reason is not fully recorded. And therefore, what I'm suggesting is that when you have a machlokas, if you darshan a Gezerah Shava, that is not a machlokas regarding the Gezerah Shava. It's a machlokas regarding the halacha that you're using the Gezerah Shava for. And on that, there can be a machlokas, because there's not necessarily a halacha l'Moshe misinai on the etzem halacha. By the way, other meforshim even say more than that. They say that even the list of word pairings is not telling you which psukim to compare. So, for example, you have a Gezerah Shava, two words are compared. Now, these two words may appear in many, many verses, and that doesn't even tell you which two are to be compared. So, the halacha l'Moshe misinai is even less clear. Not only does it not tell you the halacha, it doesn't even tell you the pasuk. It just tells you the words, and that's why there could be a machlokas if you make a Gezerah Shava between A and B or C and D, etc. So that's rule one about a Gezerah Shava, that Gezerah Shava is connected on some level to halacha l'Moshe misinai. You can't just use your logic and link two words. That's to be distinguished from kal v'chomer. Kal v'chomer is a logical argument. So even if it's true that without a Sanhedrin we can't make our own drashas, but at least every Sanhedrin could make their own kal v'chomers, because kal v'chomer depends on logic. What is chomer? What is kal? Gezerah Shava, however, is not a logical process. It is what you might call a formalistic process, and therefore there has to be what is called halacha l'Moshe misinai. And then you need to explain how is it Shayach and Machlokas on that. So that's what I told you. The halacha l'Moshe Sinai is on the words. It is not on the halacha that is derived from the words. Rule number 2 about Gezerah Shavas, interestingly enough, and this must be part of the halacha l'Moshe Sinai, is that the words do not have to be exact. So, for example, if one word is in osid and the other word is hove or avar, past, present, future, the shirish is the same. So Gezerah Shavas can be done in that particular way. And not only that, but even if it's 2 different words that have fundamentally the same meaning, synonyms, Gezerah Shavas can be based on synonyms. The Gemara gives an example. In the laws of Tsaras, a Gezerah Shava is made between one pasuk that says, V'shav HaKohen, the Kohen returns, and another pasuk says, Uvo HaKohen, the Kohen comes back. So we make a Gezerah Shava between V'shav and Ba, even though Shav and Ba are mamish, 2 different words, but they have more or less the same meaning. V'shav means he returns, Uba means he comes back, and the Gemara in Yevamah says, Zuhi Shiva, Zuhi Bia. Shiva and Bia mean the same thing, therefore it's Shayach a Gezerah Shava even there, right? So that's rule number 2. But again, in light of rule number 1, we have to say that that's part of the halacha l'Moshe Sinai, that's part of the Messiah as well. Yeah.
Could you say that they could be similar in the sense that one could be singular and one could be plural?
Yes, even that. Singular, plural, past, present, and synonyms. All of that is nichlal in the permissibility of a Gezerah Shava. Rule number 3. On a regular Gezerah Shava, ein meishivin. Ein meishivin means you cannot bring up a logical argument that the 2 cases are not comparable. Meaning, in a kal v'chomer, which is a logical argument, we can refute a kal v'chomer by showing what you think is lenient is strict, what you think is strict is lenient, right? That's an upschlag in Yiddish, we say, or a refutation, or in the language of the Gemara, a pircha. Pircha literally means breaks the kal v'chomer. In a binyan av, which is a mamatzino, same thing. You want to learn from A to B. We say, it's not logical. A is different. With Gezerah Shavas, if you're learning from A to B, right? A is your known and B is your unknown, and you're trying to learn a halacha from A to B via Gezerah Shava, even if you have logical reasons that B is not like A. I mean, listen. Truma to Me'ila. One could have said, wait, I can't learn on Me'ila from Truma. Me'ila is an Avera. You have a logical argument. But Gezerah Shavas are not based on logical arguments, and therefore you cannot do a pircha on a Gezerah Shava. You can use a pircha for a kal v'chomer. You can use a pircha for a binyanav, which is called a mamatzino in the Gemara. You cannot use a pircha on a Gezerah Shava. But that rule has exceptions. And that introduces yet a 4th idea in Gezerah Shava. And this will be a little schwer to understand it in light of the first rule, and I'll mention the question. And that is the requirement of what is called mufna. Mufna. Mufna is a Mishnaic Hebrew term. It's not, which means superfluous. And that is, in order for a Gezerah Shava to work, the word must be superfluous and otherwise unnecessary, meaning the pasuk could have been read without that word. The word is extra, and that enables a Gezerah Shava. So now the question is, which part of it is extra? Because a Gezerah Shava is connecting A and B. Does it have to be mufna on both sides? Or is it enough that it's mufna on one side? Meaning, if neither one is mufna, you can't do a Gezerah Shava. If both words are needed in their respective psukim, you cannot do the Gezerah Shava. But the question is, if it's mufna mitzad echad, does that enable the Gezerah Shava? So here is the compromise ruling that the Gemara gives us. Mufna mitzad echad, you can do a Gezerah Shava, but you can then use logic to refute it. Mufna mishnei tzadim, ein meishiven. You cannot use logic to refute it. So we have three categories. If the two words in the two verses are not superfluous, Gezerah Shava cannot be used at all. If both words are superfluous, the Gezerah Shava is used, and you cannot use logic to refute it. If it's mufna mitzad echad, you can use the Gezerah Shava, but you can then use logic. Lameidin umeishiven. Lameidin, we learn from it. Umeishiven, and we can refute it if necessary. Now, this rule of mufna seems very, very difficult in light of the first rule that all Gezerah Shavas are halacha l'moshe misina. You'll find in the Gemara very often that one man d'amar makes a Gezerah Shava because he claims the words are mufna, and the other man d'amar doesn't make the Gezerah Shava because the words are not mufna. But if there was a halacha l'moshe misina that these words are linked, then how can you make the argument it's not mufna? In other words, with Hashem, to me, it doesn't make sense that Hashem would say, you are authorized to use these words as a Gezerah Shava if you determine that they're mufna. Hashem is not going to tell you that. In other words, he's giving you like an instruction that may or may not be valid. So that's a bit of a question. How does mufna tie in with the idea of halacha l'moshe misinai? But this is a klal in Gezerah Shavas. Mufna mitzad echad l'meidin u'meishiven. Mufna mishnei tzadim l'meidin v'yein meishiven. Right? Unlike a kal v'chaymer. Okay. Of course, let me point out that even if a Gezerah Shava, even if the words are not mufna at all, so you can't make a Gezerah Shava, if there's a logical comparison, that'll fall under a binyanav, which we haven't gotten into. So you'll still be able to learn it with some of the other middos of Rabbi Yishmael, but not the midah of Gezerah Shava. Okay, so far we mentioned halacha l'moshe misinai. We mentioned the idea that we're not meishiv, and we mentioned the chiluk between mufna mitzad echad and mufna mishnei tzadim, and the fact that the halacha l'moshe misinai is only on the word pairing; it is not on the halacha that is derived from the word pairing that was given to the chachamim. Okay, a final rule, at least right now, a final rule about Gezerah Shavas is a complicated machlokes that appears a number of places in Shas. I'll give you the klal. This may be a klal that you perhaps didn't come across yet. Maybe you did. And this is a machlokes. Don mina umina, or don mina vo'uki asra. Sounds a little daunting. The klal is like this. And again, unfortunately, I don't have all the examples on me right now. I'll try to bring in more examples to illustrate it. Let's imagine we have case A and we have case B, and a Gezerah Shava is going to be used to take a law from A and apply it to B. Okay? That's what Chazal want to use the Gezerah Shava for. Now let's assume that the laws in the first situation have a lot of surrounding details. Let's call it, in other words, like this. We have case A, case B. Okay? Case A, case B. Case A has A1, A2, A3, A4, different detailed laws. Case B has a different set of laws, meaning that contradict. Right? There are A laws and there are B laws. When you learn a law from A to B, do you schlep along all of the A laws that are connected to A and bring them into B? Or once you transfer A to B, then the laws that are going to apply to what you transferred are going to be the B laws and not the A laws. Meaning, if you look at a Gezerah Shava from A to B, as if the Torah wrote this law in B, then you're going to apply all the B laws to it. If, on the other hand, you say, since I'm deriving it from A, it comes along with all of A's baggage, then you're going to apply the A laws. So let's look at the words. Don mina umina. Don is you learn. You learn from it, and therefore it has to be from it. In other words, any law you're taking from source A has to have all the laws in source A, even though source B doesn't have those laws. Don mina umina. The other opinion is, don mina, we learned a halacha from A, but once I learned the halacha from A, and I put it in B, uki, I put it ba'asra in its new location. I moved it into B. Once it's in B, it's going to have B's laws, and it's not going to have A's laws. I know without an example it might be a little hard to follow. I'll try to get you some examples about this. But this is a big machlokas, whether a Gezerah Shava is regarded as being transplanted into the new source, or whether you still have to take all of the assorted rules of the old source, even though you're applying it to the new case of B. Okay, so that's a general machlekes in how far a Gezerah Shava goes. Okay, so that's kind of the basic rules regarding a Gezerah Shava. And once again, how could there be a machlokes about a Gezerah Shava if everything is Nimser L'Sinai? So there are two ways there could be a machlokes. One could be that even though the word pairs were given to Moshe, the halacha to be derived was not, and therefore there could be a machlokes. The other could be an argument on the issue of mufna, because if the Gezerah Shava can be activated only if it's mufna, well, mufna is a grammatical issue. Is it an extra word or is it not an extra word? There can often be a machlokas based on the syntax, based on the grammar, whether words are extra or words are not extra. That could be a source of machlokas even within the Messiah of Gezerah Shava. Okay? So those are the first two Middos of Rabbi Yishmael. We have Kal V'chomer and we have Gezerah Shava. Now we have the third rule, which is a very, very important rule, and that is called Binyan Av. Now, Binyan Av literally means the building of the father, or one might define Av as primary source, building from a primary source. Now, the Gemara, just as Kal V'chomer is often referred to as Kol Shekain, those are synonyms. So Binyan Av in the Gemara is often goes by a different name. It is called Ma Motzinu. So Ma Motzinu and Binyan Av are the same thing. Okay, sometimes, why sometimes one phrase is used and why the other, I don't know, but they are the same thing. Binyan Av simply means the ability to generalize based on logic, the ability to draw analogies. So, for example, let's take shalichus once again. How do we know there's such a thing as shalichus, that I could have one person act for me? So we know it from Truma. We have a few psukim by Truma that says there's a shaliach. Right? So for Me'ila, I needed a Gezerah Shava because that's an Aveira. But how do you know there's shalichus by Kedushin? How do you know there's shalichus by Gershon? The answer is that once the Torah tells me a rule, I am allowed to generalize the rule. In other words, the Torah says something in one context, I can generalize it, unless I have a reason not to do that. So this is where pircha comes in all the time. Right? Chazal say, how do I know this halacha? So we say, I learn it out of somewhere. Well, what do you mean you learn it out of somewhere? But that's somewhere, that's that case. So what you're doing is, whether you know it or not, you're doing a binyan of. You're saying, I learn it out of that. And then the Gemara will say, no, you can't learn it out of that. Mala that, which has a certain characteristic. What is that doing? That's simply saying your analogy, which is a logical analogy, is not logical because there's a difference between the cases. It's similar to a kal v'chomer, but instead of chomer kal, you're simply saying these cases are not analogous. They are not the same. So this is where svara comes in the full way, because essentially, binyan av is reasoning by analogy, generalization, and you refute a binyan av by showing the analogy is not a valid analogy because the cases are different. So this is a very, very important principle. It permits the chachamim to apply halacha to new cases based on the analogies in the existing cases. Right? So, for example, if the Torah talks about an ox goring, we will apply it to other animals, other situations, by analogy. And what are you using when you use analogy? Binyan av. Ma motzinu. And then you have a lot of debates regarding the logic of it. So a binyan av is not a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. A binyan av, the midah is halacha l'Moshe Sinai. But a binyan av is reasoning by analogy. That is called a binyan av. Now, it then says, binyan av mikosov echad. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Before I leave that, let me mention an interesting rule about a binyan av. So a binyan av says, if the Torah gives the halacha in case A, and it didn't give me the halacha in case B, I'm allowed to generalize it unless there's a logical reason why the cases are not comparable. It's not based on Gezei Rishava, it's not based on Kal V'chomer, it's based on general analogy. Now, there is a rule, which is actually machlokas in the Gemara, but we paskin this way. Shnei kesuvim haboin ki echad ein melamdin. If the Torah taught you the same halacha in two areas, you will be disabled from making a binyan av to case number 3. So, if the Torah taught me a law only in A, I can go from A to B, A to C, A to D, A to Z. But let's say the Torah taught me the same halacha in A and in B. And I want to extend it logically to C or D. And I want to use a binyan av. So here's the argument. Hey, if the Torah wanted you to generalize, why did the Torah give you a case B? It should have just given you a case A, and I would have known B, C, D, and Z. Why did the Torah repeat the law in case B if you have a binyan av from case A? It must be that the Torah is telling you, don't generalize. And once the Torah told you, don't generalize, I only have A and B, I can no longer make a binyan av for C, D, E, F, Z. Again, what's the klal? Shnei kesuvim haboim ki echad. 2 psukim that are teaching me the same halacha. Ein melamdin. We cannot learn out to another case that halacha through binyan av, Because if a binyan av was valid, there would be no reason to have the second repetition. Because I could have gotten the second from the first. If the Torah put in the second, even though I could have gotten it from the first, it must be the Torah is giving me a message. The message is, don't generalize beyond what I tell you. So I got A and I got B. I cannot make a binyan av to C, D, E, and F. Shnei kesuvim haboan ki echad. Now, that's an exception to binyan av. Let me give you an exception to the exception. If B is logically not analogous to A, so I wouldn't have been able to know B from A, there would have been a pircha on that first binyan av to B, and the Torah had to write B, because there would have been a logical pircha to go from A to B. Then, the fact that the Torah wrote B is not a negation of binyan av, and I can make a binyan av to C, D, and Z if there's no logical pircha on them. So, again, this is a very common structural feature of a sugya, in which one mandiyamar would say, I can't include C because A and B are shnei kesuvim haboyin ki echad. And shnei kesuvim haboyin ki echad ein malamdin. And the other mandiyamar will say, no, it's not shnei kesuvim haboyin ki echad, tzarichi. I wouldn't have known A from B, I wouldn't have known B from A. Therefore, I needed both psukim. Therefore, the binyan av is not negated to C, D, Z, etc. Okay? Again, this is a structure. You'll see, in other words, the Gemara has, the sugyas that deal with drushes, many sugyas don't deal with drushes, tend to have a common structural pattern. And these are one of the patterns that you will often see in a discussion of the drushes. Okay, that's called binyan av, and technically it's called binyan av mikasav echad, a binyan av from one verse, and that'll create a problem when it's shnei kesuv mabon ki echad, etc. And okay, now it then says in the fourth midah, binyan av mishnei kesuvim. Now, don't confuse this with Shnei Ksuv Mabon Ki Echad Ein Malamdin. Shnei Ksuv Mabon Ki Echad Ein Malamdin is when you bedafka don't do a binyan av. But this is a binyan av Mishnei Kesuvim, and this will apply in the following way. Let's say the Torah wrote a din in case A, and you want to learn it out to case C. Mamatzino. But the problem is you have a logical pircha that C is not the same as A. So you can't learn it out from A. But the Torah also wrote case B, A and B. So this is the methodology that's known as Tzad HaShaveh. Tzad HaShaveh means common denominator. Meaning, the way it works is the following. The Torah gave me two cases. The Torah gave me case A, and the Torah gave me case B. I want to learn out a case C. When I compare C to A, I got a distinction. When I compare case C to B, I got a distinction. But the distinction that B has is not possessed by A, and the distinction that A has is not possessed by B. Therefore, these distinctions are not responsible for the halacha that's there. So as a result, when A and B are teaching me the same halacha, but each one of them has a different characteristic, the differences get canceled. I look at the common denominator, and then I include anything else, C, D, Z, that has the common denominator that exists between A and B. That's called binyan av mishnei kesuvim, and in the language of the Sakavatarya of Gemara, that is called Hatzad Hashove Shebahem. These get, again, the examples are complicated too. These sometimes get very, very intricate in the Gemaras themselves. But Tzad Hashava is finding a common denominator that will then permit generalization to new cases, even though you could not have made a binyan av from the individual cases. So binyan av mikasav echad, binyan av mishnei kesuvim. And by the way, don't confuse that with Shnei Kesuv Mabon Ki Echad. Shnei Kesuv Mabon Ki Echad is when there's no difference between A and B, and therefore the repetition was superfluous, therefore it's excluding a binyan av. But binyan av Mishnei Kesuv is where I wouldn't know B from A, I wouldn't know A from B. I needed to have both, and then I look for a common denominator to include other cases. So even though you couldn't have made a binyan av from either A or B, you can make a binyan av from A and B by canceling out the characteristic that the other cases don't have. Okay? Ma hatzad, again, different words. Ma hatzad, hatzad hashava. All of that is called a binyan av mishnei kesuvim. Okay, so today so far we did a total of 4. We did kal v'chomer, we did gezei reshava, binyan av mikosav echad, binyan av mishnei kesuvim. Okay, so we'll continue tomorrow. Take care.